Before we even get started, I just want to quickly say Ripley, the bride, Elizabeth Bennet, Sarah Connor, Vin, Katniss Everdeen, Jyn Erso, Beth Harmon, Padme Amidala, and Éowyn. These are some of my favorite strong female characters, but in Rings of Power, Galadriel is not only bland and uninteresting, she's actively unlikable, and a flagrant mockery of feminine strength. One of the most controversial things to come out of Rings of Power Season 1 and now Season 2 has been Morfydd Clark's portrayal of the character Galadriel. Now, I'll be honest, my perspective on the situation was initially pretty shallow. In the books, and certainly in the films, Galadriel is portrayed as the pinnacle of feminine grace and beauty, a lady straight out of fairy tales and myths, and some even theorize an homage to the Blessed Virgin Mary herself. But in listening to various commentators and even the comment section, I discovered a bit of nuance to the situation. So, I decided to do the research and put the debate to rest once and for all. Regardless of what some have claimed, Tolkien did not hate strong women, and even given the social norms of the time, seemed to go out of his way to portray several female characters in the lore and history of The Lord of the Rings who were warriors and went to war. Éowyn is probably the most well-known. While not commonly sent to war, Éowyn was a shield maiden, in a long tradition of shield maidens in the lands of Rohan, who in times of need would go to war alongside the men. There were the Easterling women, who also fought on occasion. Emeldir, mother of Beren, Princess Idril the Silverfoot, the Lady Haleth of Halidin, and finally, Galadriel. That's right, Galadriel. In fact, this is Tolkien's descriptions of Galadriel in her youth. Her mother name was Nerwyn, Man-Maiden, and she grew to be tall beyond the measure even of the women of Noldor. She was strong of body, mind, and will, a match for both the lore masters and the athletes of the Eldar in the days of their youth. She was proud, strong, and self-willed, as were all the descendants of Finwë save Finarfin. So that's pretty clear, right? I mean, given these descriptions of Galadriel in the First and early Second Age, what exactly is wrong with Rings of Power's portrayal of the character? Well, I'm of the firm opinion that the devil is in the details, and many, if not all, bad books, shows, and movies could have been great. They were simply misused in the hands of their creators. And I think the same can be said for Rings of Power and the character of Galadriel. We start the series with Galadriel as a child, building a paper boat and then being bullied by a group of other elf children before her brother calls her off to have a conversation, which doesn't actually quite make a lot of sense when you start to think about it.
Do you know why a ship floats and a stone cannot? But the ship has a secret. For unlike the stone, her gaze is not downward but up.
Then Morgoth happens, then Sauron, and then her brother dies. Galadriel, grown up, takes on his cause and seeks vengeance for her brother's death, relentlessly searching for Sauron, who killed her brother and marked his skin. An epic showdown that we definitely should have seen in the opening of the show, by the way. On paper, it's not a bad character, and is actually somewhat reminiscent of the young Galadriel described by Tolkien. But let's take a closer look at how it's actually done. We don't know why Galadriel is bullied, she just is. We don't understand why she and her brother are so close, they just are. We lack the narrative context to actually feel the things the story wants us to, so instead we are just told to. I mean, the narration by Galadriel literally tells us what Galadriel is going to do after her brother's death when we could have just watched it and very clearly understood.
In the darkness, his vow became mine.
And this continues on into her first real scene in the show. Galadriel, now commander of the Northern armies, leads them in search of Sauron and his remaining forces, quite literally to the end of the world. Despite the advice of her lieutenant, she continues into the snow because vengeance, single-handedly kills a troll randomly, and then is proved correct that Sauron was once here by a symbol that she tells us means that. That right there is a conflicting image. Galadriel is competent enough to be the commander of the Northern Elf armies, yet has literally hunted for centuries and centuries without any evidence of Sauron. And it's not that all the evidence is gone, as this scene reveals it isn't, it's just that she wasn't able to find it. Which is just kind of objectively incompetent. Like, really incompetent. So why is she a commander? Obsession with a cause is a great character flaw, and vengeance is the perfect emotional vehicle for it. Perhaps she has a reason to think this way, to act this way, but it's so early on in the show that we haven't been given the opportunity to see these reasons, and so instead, her character comes off as just foolish and unreasonably abrasive.
Don't plant roots. Keep moving.
We relate to characters because they have flaws, but that's dependent on knowing them and liking them. I know that defenders of the show will say that Galadriel has a long ways to go before she becomes the character that we know from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. But in simply watching season 1 and 2, it's unclear as to whether the creators themselves consider these blind spots to be character flaws or admirable qualities. A fact that is made all the more unclear by the kind of general air of immaturity that is sprinkled over the entire project, and I think makes everything a bit unrealistic. I know. In a world of orcs, elves, trolls, and dwarves, realism doesn't really seem like something anybody should be concerned about. Perhaps grounded is a better word. When writing any story, but especially something in a sci-fi or fantasy world, the coherence of your narrative is entirely dependent on you establishing a list of rules and standards for that world, and then following through on the natural consequences of these standards. For example, the elves of Tolkien's world are immortal, almost angelic, ethereal beings with wisdom beyond one's wildest dreams. Regardless of what Peter Jackson did, that brings a certain image to mind. Right? A certain long-lost wisdom, a knowledge, a patience about the world and the way things are done, and even in its most negative form, a certain air of elitism, isolationism, and disgust for all things that seem even remotely evil. But when watching Galadriel, Celebrimbor, Gil-galad, and even Elrond interact, I don't believe any of this. In an attempt to be more like current-day fantasy, the elves are portrayed as petty and immature. Greedy creatures no different than anyone else except for their pointy ears and wigs of varying quality. This kind of behavior seems totally out of character for the people of this medieval setting, and certainly for the elves. To me, it reveals the creators' inability to break away from their own perspective. It removes the audience from the narrative, and it demonstrates a lack of understanding of the source material in the process. So, as unsatisfying as it may be, I don't think there's one clear reason as to why this portrayal of Galadriel is in conflict with the descriptions that Tolkien wrote. It's many reasons, a death by 1,000 cuts, if you will. See, the problem is not that Galadriel fights, or is in armor, or is proud, or is played by someone who isn't Cate Blanchett. The lore provides plentiful material for a strong female character with her fair share of flaws, relatable traits, and a wickedly satisfying character arc as she matures from a fiery warrior to a peaceful, confident queen. It's that she is an unlikable, stereotypical version of this, complete with the convenient removal of her loving and strong husband, Celeborn, and even her surviving brothers, who apparently play key roles in the Second Age. Rings of Power is a show whose execution lacks quality, while also being steeped in what I think is a creatively immature perspective on the world, on the morality, and on the characters. I mean, it's even present in the promotional material. There are ads, trying to ship Galadriel and Sauron, and that's to say nothing of the fact that maybe the writers are doing that too. It's silly. It's like a high school teacher trying too hard to be friends with his students. It's not cool, and it makes everyone respect what you're trying to do even less. Fundamentally, Rings of Power seems in direct opposition of the contemplative, philosophical, and deeply moral fiction that Professor Tolkien created. It's not inaccurate simply because of differences in lore, characters, or timelines. It's that the creators failed to understand what made Lord of the Rings so successful in the first place. The resonance of an epic story of good versus evil, and the incredible moral nuance that can be found in such a story without resorting to on-the-nose allegories or, pointless nihilism. Lord of the Rings is one of the foundational works of fantasy fiction, shaping what we understand the genre to be in our modern time. It's a property and an author that deserve the utmost respect. And it's that lack of respect which is the true problem with Rings of Power and its take on Galadriel. A respect for the lore, a respect for the character, and a respect for a true and honest portrayal of feminine strength. As always, let me know what you guys thought in the comments down below. What do you think of this version of Galadriel? What do you think of Rings of Power overall? I'm not a huge fan of focusing exclusively on creators or on the negatives, and so I do really want to kind of engage with a nuanced discussion about this, because I actually think the issue is, trickier than a lot of people like to portray it out to be. So please feel free to jump in the comments. I certainly will be there, kind of answering or discussing along with you guys. And as always, no matter what you do, keep reading, keep writing, and I will see you all in the next video.